All right, so it's 8 o'clock and we're going to give our audience just a couple minutes to all get logged on, and then we'll start the discussion. All right, we're not quite to 8:02, but let's go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone. I'm Gary Grotto. I'm the executive editor of the Arizona Capital Times, and thank you for joining us for the next hour here on Morning Scoop. And we're going to talk about the post-COVID spike in chronic absenteeism in Arizona schools. Helios Foundation, in association with WestEd, developed a study on chronic absenteeism for K to 8th graders in Arizona public schools during the 2021 school year. And Helios, having done this study, is sponsoring today's discussion, and I would like to thank the organization for that. Thank you very much. And Helios Education Foundation exists to support post-secondary attainment for low-income and underrepresented communities in Arizona and Florida. Driven by their fundamental beliefs of community, equity, investment, and partnership, Helios has invested nearly $300 million in partnerships and initiatives focused on improving education outcomes in the 2 states it serves. At this time, I'd like to introduce Paul Peralt, Senior Vice President for Community Impact and Learning, and he's going to tell us a little bit about why they're sponsoring today's Morning Scoop and why we're here. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Gary, and I'm glad to see everybody here so early, and excited to be here today. As Gary introduced me, I'm Paul Peralt. I'm our Senior Vice President of Community Impact and Learning at Helios Education Foundation. And I really want to start out and thank Gary and the Arizona Capital Times for hosting us this conversation about an issue that's important for Arizonans, but also really important nationally for students right now. We're excited to sponsor and convene this webinar because the issue of chronic absence is one of the ways Arizona is experiencing what we call the lingering effects of COVID. And it's disproportionately affecting low-income students and Latino students in Arizona, which are those students that Helios really primarily serves. For both of those reasons, this is a central issue to our strategy and the work that we're trying to do to improve educational opportunities for all students. We're showing this work today and sponsoring this webinar because Helios strives to lead with data. And so there was a lot of research and data that went up behind this to understand what are those impacts that are happening with students, who's missing school, why they're missing school, so that we can actually make informed decisions. We created a policy brief, and that is the heart of the research work. Part of it is to focus our conversation so that we can strive to improve education in the state. In addition, again, I can't thank enough our other 2 guests with us today, Lori Masur from Redon, Arizona, and Dr. Betsy Hargrove, Superintendent of the Avondale School District, 2 other leaders around chronic absenteeism and how they're actually looking for ways to improve educational opportunities in the state. As we think about the work, one of the things over the last couple of years, especially in Arizona, I would say, is it's easy to think that the pandemic is over. We're back to our everyday lives where we go out, we go to stores, we're going to schools, but the lingering effects of COVID are not over, and they're going to have serious consequences for student learning. And so I'm glad that we're here to be able to shed some light on this and to talk about what we've learned, talk about what's hampering students, and really what I hope we get to at the end is offering solutions so that next year we're not having the same discussions around chronic absenteeism, but we're talking about the improvements that we're having in getting students back on track. So thank you, Gary. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And as Paul mentioned, also joining us is Lori Masur of Read On Arizona and Dr. Betsy Hargrove, the superintendent of Avondale Elementary School District. Lori is the director of early learning for Read On Arizona, the state's collective impact initiative for early literacy. Formerly with the Arizona Department of Education, she oversees collaborative efforts to improve school readiness and support the language and literacy development of Arizona's youngest children. Lori joined Read On Arizona in July after 8 years with the Department of Education's early childhood education team, supporting the work of teachers and administrators and providing high quality educational opportunities for children from birth to age 8. Good morning, Lori. And Betsy has been the superintendent of Avondale Elementary School District since 2012. She provides ongoing leadership and works to engage in continuous improvement by implementing and monitoring the achievement of district goals and mission for every student to grow as a thinker, problem solver, and communicator to pursue a future without limits. Ensuring this mission is reached, Betsy and her team actively seek opportunities to build relationships with community stakeholders, business people, and civic leaders to make connections within the districts and sites. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hargrove.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
And I've already introduced Paul Peralt, but I want to give you a little bit about his background. Dr. Peralt is charged with leading the development of the Foundation's research and evaluation agenda and in managing Helios grants and project management team. Paul comes to Helios with more than 15 years of research and evaluation experience. Prior to joining Helios, he was a researcher at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, where he served as lead investigator on Arizona's Move On When Ready evaluation and as principal investigator on UMA's Ready Now UMA evaluation. Before we begin, I would like to direct our audience to the chat function and invite you to participate by submitting questions and comments to the panel. And we'll try to get to as many of your questions as time permits. So I want to start off by putting up a slide for Sorry, I don't have anybody in the control booth this morning, so it's going to move a little slow when I do the slides here. But Paul, we've got the definition of chronic absenteeism in Arizona. So one of the things I want to do is, define it before we begin the discussion. And our newspaper covers the legislature, and we write a lot about spending caps and vouchers, and probably even going to be writing about pronouns because there's a bill that has to do with that. But nobody's talking about chronic absenteeism. But I see it in all the education publications, in the education world. We're in a crisis, right?
We are, Gary, definitely in a crisis right now. And again, back to this not being just an Arizona issue, this is really a national issue around students and being in school. And I'll talk a little bit about just so that we're all on the same page about chronic absenteeism, of what it really means, the definition. So, chronic absenteeism is really kind of defined as missing 10% or more of the school year nationally, but especially in Arizona. There's 180 days, school days typically. So that's about 18 days per year. And those days can be excused or unexcused, even including suspensions. And it's different from what we think of in the past as truancy, which are only unexcused absences. Chronic absenteeism takes into account excused and unexcused. And what you also have to think about is that chronic absenteeism is only focusing on the number of days that a student misses in an individual school. And let me give you an example. Let me say that I started school at Phoenix Bioscience, and I missed 12 days of school. And then I moved to Yuma, and I went to Cibola High School. If I ended up missing another 10 days, I technically would not be flagged as being chronically absent because it all has to do with what school you're in. So it's important to understand that while there's a certain number, a lot of students that are chronically absent, there are a number of students that are absent in multiple schools that aren't being accounted for. And why it's important is because there's a number of issues that happen when you start missing a lot of school. Number one is missed instructional time. So students can't learn if they're not in school. That goes back to, some of my earliest learnings from my parents is, if you have to be in school to learn how to read, how to write, how to do math. And I think some of those things have become more tedious as there's different ways to look at how math is instructed and other things too. So that's an important issue. It leads to decreased academic achievement, something that we've been paying attention to with NAEP over the last couple months, looking at third grade reading and mathematics. And so if you're not in school, we're going to see those decreases over time. It can also lead to subsequent absences in later grades. And we can talk about that later, is that if you start getting off track, and usually it happens in elementary school, it leads to you missing more school each year. And ultimately, for many students, it leads to dropping out if you're not involved in school, if you don't feel like you should be there. And all of that, is a main problem. If you think about where you want to have opportunities in your future, going to college, what type of careers you might be trained in. And so that's why lower graduation rates, dropping out, all of this can start stemming off just from students missing too much school.
Great, thank you, Paul. Lori, so which student and school characteristics are most related to chronic absenteeism?
Absolutely. So what we've noticed in the data, and I'm sure Paul will also speak to this in a bit, is that what we notice is that we tend to see a higher chronic absence rate for children that are economically disadvantaged. For instance, the population of students who are receiving free and reduced lunch within schools. The data has also indicated that we tend to see a higher chronic absence rates for students who are identified as receiving special education services. So when we have schools that have a higher concentration of free and reduced lunch, we see a spike in the chronic absenteeism there. I think it is important to note that we've seen this spike in chronic absenteeism universally across the state and in all schools, but we have seen it exacerbated in our BIPOC population and our economically disadvantaged population. In particular, in our indigenous lands, we've seen a spike in chronic absenteeism. And again, like I said, in our SPED population. But I think it's important to realize that this is, to Paul's point earlier, this was a crisis prior to the pandemic, and it certainly has been exacerbated in a post-pandemic landscape here in the state.
Thank you, Lori. And yeah, it's amazing how it spiked up. And so Betsy, when I was talking with your fellow panelists the other day, they said that your district was a phenomenal case study for addressing it, I think were the words. And can you tell us a little bit about, obviously they said that you've been doing this since, way before the pandemic and way before it was a crisis, and, that you're the model. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, thank you. I will tell you, I appreciate the kind words. We have worked very hard on this, and it stemmed truly from our work with Read on Avondale and sitting down with our leader and having that real frank conversation around what is chronic absenteeism. And Paul did a phenomenal job describing that and defining that for everyone, because until you completely understand that, chronic absenteeism almost is invisible, to be honest. Often children who are chronically absent aren't even necessarily children who are not doing well academically. However, and it impacts what's happening in the classroom, and it impacts their trajectory. They are not getting that, as we like to say, that pursuing growing as thinkers, problem solvers, and communicators. They're not maximizing that potential because they're not present. You can't read unless you're present. You can't learn to read. And so when you think about that, all of those things, when it was brought to light with our team, it was like, whoa, we had a 94% attendance rate. However, we still had a significant number of children who were chronically absent. And so we were looking at the wrong measures. So the first thing we did was we looked at data. As Paul said, data tells the story. Lori, I know, would agree with this. And until you have the right data in front of you, you can't address any of it, and you can't have a factual and frank conversation. So we started that probably back in 2015. And we recognized immediately we had some challenges, and we had several sites who just jumped on that challenge and said, we're going to change that. And it was from anything from data conversations to knee-to-knee conversations with kids and with parents and home visits to say this needs to be addressed and needs to be changed, and how can we solve that by determining what the root cause is. With sites that did that, we had phenomenal results. We literally, decreased absenteeism by chronic absenteeism by 50% easily, if not more. And when we ended our work didn't end our work, but when everything shifted prior to the pandemic, we literally were at about a 10.8% chronic absenteeism, which was half of what it was when we started across our district. I don't think we had anyone above an 11%, which was phenomenal. A lot of successes to be had than the pandemic. And the pandemic certainly shifted everything for everyone. And I know we're going to have further conversation with that, but some of the things that we need to really think about are those changes in habits and behaviors where we said, we want you to be in school, we need you to be in school, and these are the benefits that you're going to get from being in school, to we need you to stay home for 10 days consecutively. And and feeding that conversation, and then not to mention all the fears, the anxieties, the worriment, missed opportunities at school, which then had children not finding their entry point when they came back. All of those things coming into play that we've had to now navigate on the other side of the pandemic.
Now, Lori, when we were talking the other day, it's kind of left to the school districts to, I guess, manage their attendance and manage how to deal with chronic absenteeism. So there's really no common policy or practice, right?
That's correct. So as many people probably know, Arizona is a local control state when it comes to our school districts. So the districts have and schools have autonomy in how they choose to address chronic absence within their school district. And I know we're going to talk a little bit on this later, but that's why it's important as we think about 2023 and beyond, as we begin to convene a statewide task force to address chronic absence, is how do we provide those statewide policy recommendations and implementation recommendations that are effective and that are evidence-based, so that districts and schools can adopt those recommendations that are set forth in a very positive, non-punitive way, so that we're really talking about, to Betsy's point earlier, how are we engaging families, how are we engaging students, and how are we really taking this from thinking about interventions and multi-tiered systems of support approach to supporting and engaging families and students so that they do attend on a regular basis and they understand the importance of attending on a regular basis, in particular to some of the things Paul spoke about earlier, about once they become disengaged, they begin to sort of veer onto this track where they're more inclined, in middle school and beyond, to either we see higher dropout rates or a fewer number of students going on to college and career and beyond. So it definitely has this ripple effect that begins in K-3. And I would even put my early childhood hat on and go, even in the preschool space, really emphasizing consistent attendance for students.
And
Now,
Gary, if I might jump in too, one of the things, as you talked about, really the districts and schools figuring out what to do, I'd be remiss if I didn't actually, really thank the Arizona Department of Education and the State Board of Education, because they have been key partners at the top, really working with us on the data, how we share this information with districts and schools, how we share it with other legislative leaders and policymakers too. So they've really been key to us analyzing the data and being able to show those trends so that we can get the message out there that this is a problem that we should all be thinking about too. So I think that's one of the key ways that the leadership at the top have been focused on this issue, even though it's still up for the districts and schools to figure out what's the best methods for them to get students to come back.
Sorry, can I,
Go
Gary, I just have to layer in with what both Lori and Paul are saying. relative to those younger years. The more we can emphasize good attendance and building those habits, literally in preschool, Head Start, into kindergarten and so forth. Some of the challenges we have is, oh, kindergarten's not mandatory, preschool's not mandatory. Those are the formative years in building those habits of coming, attending, be a part of a community, and building those foundational skills. And specifically in an elementary school district, those areas, the pre-K and kindergarten, is where we see significant absences. And then it kind of sorts itself out in the middle, and then getting back up into those middle grades. We've got to address it in all areas, but specifically at those younger early years.
Now, before we get into, some of the ideas and things that, practices that you've used, Betsy, we were talking a little earlier about what you all knew it as the Hetchinger report. I knew it as the Arizona Center for Investigative story that they did with, they collaborated with Hetchinger. But, one of the numbers that they talked about was, I think over a 5-year period, and it's really recent, 47,000 students have been suspended for chronic absenteeism. And I guess that's one way to deal with it. It doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, what do you guys think about that? Because, we're going to keep you home for not coming to school.
Well, as I'm sure that you saw, Gary, when suspensions are used, and as it was referred to in the Hetchinger report, it can be counterintuitive, which is why Read On Arizona is going to be serving as this state literacy hub where we will form a state professional learning community focused on chronic absenteeism to help reduce that learning loss in an approach that is non-punitive, so that we're able to create guidance to address chronic absence relative to policy and implementation recommendation as mentioned beforehand, so that we can ensure the field has access to proven effective practices and a sustainable model. To Paul's point earlier, suspensions are included in the data for chronic absence. And so if the student doesn't have their bottom in a seat, so to speak, receiving those effective instructional practices, we're exacerbating the issue with using suspensions. It's only adding to the number of chronically absent days, and it's only contributing to not having those students engaged in a classroom with their peers, with their students, and with the teacher having access to that effective instruction.
So
Yeah.
I might add on that, Gary, with that report, often, as Paul said, as children become disengaged, then that leads to other actions where they are going to engage themselves. And sometimes it's not necessarily the absence that leads to that direct suspension. It's the absence and behaviors upon return or behaviors on reentry, and the challenges that children have when they have missed the instruction, they don't have an entry point, and therefore are frustrated and disengaged in the classroom, which lead to other behaviors that could be coupled with the suspension that actually is connected to the absence. So it's multiple infractions could be included within that one set of circumstances. Yes, the absences and the behaviors upon return, if that makes sense. And I did speak to the researchers around that, because when you're collecting a data set, if you're looking at the entire raw data, connecting the multiple offenses that could be connected to one suspension could be coupled with that. So I would just caution to say, I don't know it's always a 1-for-1. I do know, I do know that it is a concern, and I do know that's one of the reasons why CUTS has gone away from the punitive actions, because it was not found to be successful.
Yeah, and I would join on with both Lori and Betsy there, that I think the evidence is clear. If it was 1-for-1, they were just chronically absent and we're going to suspend them, that doesn't work. There was probably other things going on for some of those students. But I think that the evidence and the research is clear that taking students out of the classroom because they're missing school only leads to more disengagement. I don't think that there's an argument to be made that that's a good case. I think what we need to start doing is what we start seeing in other articles, and what and people like Betsy and others are doing across districts and schools, are looking for the rewards. Number one, the rewards at the level at how can you push your district and school leadership, principals, teachers, counselors to what can they do to get more students back in the school? Sometimes that's a competition between principals and counselors, that make it an incentive to get those kids back to school. The other thing is to look for ways to have that connection with families. Why is it important to be in school? Instead of sending a letter after somebody's missed 10 days of school, how do you reach out to them day 1 or day 2 to reinforce the importance of school? Back to that Wall Street Journal article, I think we talked about a little bit about a week or 10 days ago. They talked about new ways people were giving students an opportunity to do laundry there. What are, that might not have access to that as much at home. So we need to turn away from those punishments and looking at the ways to reinforce students back at school. For a number of kids, they might only get meals when they come to school. So taking all those things together, there's definitely a better avenue to think about what are the positive reinforcements to show people and legislators, policymakers, parents, all those people why it's important for kids to be in school. My mom and dad used to always say all the time, Gary, the more you're in school, the less you're causing trouble. And that gets back to that point too. If kids aren't, not skipping school, there's less opportunities for them to get themselves in other trouble, which can even make them more disengaged from school.
Now, let's talk about your study a little bit, Paul. The chronic absenteeism rates increased for all students during the pandemic, but some groups saw this, steeper increases. And I'm going to share a couple of slides with you, and if you could take us through that. And I'll wake up the guys in the booth again.
You're the guy in the booth, Gary.
There we go. There's the first one, the economic disadvantage slide.
Thank you, Gary. So we looked at a lot of trends in chronic absenteeism, and we are still continuing to look at those trends. But we focus primarily on this research for grades K through 8. There's a lot of other things that happen when you start getting to high school and how they look at chronic absenteeism for different classes and that. And so we wanted to start with the younger grades, especially because those are the ones that, again, you get off of track in those younger grades, we start getting disentangled or disengaged from schools. People often think about it as the older grades though, or really leaving school, but it's those younger grades where this really starts happening. In fact, we don't have a slide of it, Gary, but if I put it up, it would almost be like a bowl. We see lots of chronic absenteeism in kindergarten and first grade, preschool, those types of things. And, in that instance, we're having families really start thinking about, I want my child to stay at home, or I miss them, and other reasons why kids might miss school in kindergarten and first grade, especially. And then it flattens out to about third. And then each year it starts going up in a linear fashion. So you'd have kind of like that upward arrow of kids missing school. And it's at that point where we start really to worry, because if you're off track in reading in third grade and you start missing school, and then fourth grade, you increase that chronic absenteeism. Now you're getting a little bit farther off in reading and math. You start getting so disengaged that by the time you do really hit junior high, high school, why come to school anymore? And that's why I really want to focus in on the early grades and why we pay attention to them. Because if you get off track in those early grades, I can't reinforce that enough, the likelihood of you being off track or leaving school gets much higher in the end for high school. So looking at that, one of the things that I will say is, during the school years before the pandemic, about 12 to 14% of students in Arizona were chronically absent. And if you think about our school population, that's about 100,000 students in Arizona that were chronically absent each year. When we start getting to 2021, those rates spiked to 22%. So, now we're at 14. Imagine, that almost doubling, or eight additional points. And in that chronic absenteeism, one of the things that we saw is that there wasn't equal distribution of how kids were missing school. So if everybody was missing school at the same rate, whether you were free and reduced lunch or non-free and reduced lunch, those things would kind of would be equal. And we use free and reduced lunch as a proxy for everyone for economically disadvantaged, just like the school districts do and the Department of Education. And so with the graphic that I'm showing here, or you're showing for us, Gary, really does two things. On the left hand of the column, or the left-hand side, are those students for two cohorts, grade 5 and grade 7. The blue line represents the 2017 cohort. So in 2017, on the left-hand side, the blue line would go from grade 5 to grade 7. On the right-hand side is free and reduced. Are those students that are on free and reduced lunch. The blue line, again, is from 2017 to 2019. The orange line is the 19 cohort. So now those students started in 2019. In 7th grade, they would be in 2021. And so what we're really looking here is a comparison of those students that are on free and reduced lunch compared to those kids that are not on free and reduced lunch, those two cohorts. And what you can see on that right side is especially that later cohort of students that are on free and reduced lunch, that right side orange line has really spiked, meaning that students that are economically disadvantaged are missing school at a much higher rate than those students that are not economically disadvantaged. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because when we start looking at data around 3rd grade reading, for example, 8th grade math, high school graduation, those students that are economically disadvantaged tend to have lower academic scores. And if we start seeing them miss more school than even before the pandemic, the worry is that the educational or opportunity gaps are only going to increase. So we're going to have students that are poorer or on free and reduced lunch actually having a bigger gaps than those students that are not there, dropping out more, doing worse on 3rd grade reading, doing worse on 8th grade math, all of those things, especially since they're not in school at the same time. Gary, if it's good for you, I would like you to go to the next slide that's on race and ethnicity, if that works.
Let's see if I can get this thing to.
Now in this slide,
hold on one second. I went one too far there, Paul. There we go.
Now, so the last slide was really kind of, looking at things neutrally. We were only looking at things that were those students that were free and reduced lunch and those that weren't. One of the things that Lori and Betsy have talked about already is that chronic absenteeism was an issue before the pandemic started. And I'm going to highlight where that was the case for some students even more. Now, instead of looking at free and reduced lunch, this graphic really is looking at cohorts of students again. Those starting in 2017 are the blue lines. Those starting in 2019 are the orange lines. And on the left, and then what we see across the bottom are different groups of students by race or ethnicity. So the first column is American Indian or Native Americans. The second column is Asian students. The third column, Black or African American. Fourth, Hispanic or Latino. And the last column is white students. One of the things I think you can see is if you look at that first column of Native American students is before the pandemic, Native American students were already missing a lot of school. They were our group of students that were the most chronically absent. But the pandemic exacerbated it, where about 33% of Native Americans were missing school or being chronically absent before the pandemic. In the 2021 cohort, nearly 1 out of every 2 Native Americans was missing, was chronically absent. So really kind of exacerbating an issue that was already happening, but now we're kind of really focusing in on that. But the other kind of thing that you can easily see here is that overall for Asian students, it stayed pretty consistent during the pandemic, before the pandemic, and after the pandemic. But if we look especially now, if we do comparisons between white students, Hispanic students, African American students, one of the things I would say is that before the pandemic, white students, Hispanic students, African American students, if you look at all those lines, especially the 2017 cohorts, they almost look pretty much the same. Students were chronically absent among those 3 groups at the same rates. But now look at the orange lines for African Americans and Hispanics for the 2019 cohorts. So for the 2019 cohorts, what we see now is for African American and Hispanic students, basically those 2 groups of students are nearly doubling in the amount of times they're chronically absent. Why is that important again? Back to kind of the same story we were talking about, the economically disadvantaged. If we looked at third grade reading now for the state, we would see big opportunity gaps between white students, Hispanic students, and Black students. If we continue to see those students missing more and more school, we're only likely to see those gaps get bigger. And so that's why we want to make sure that we get students back in school. That's why this issue is a root cause issue. We need students back in school. Otherwise, we're going to see bigger gaps in reading. We're going to see bigger gaps in math. We're going to see bigger gaps in graduation rates. And we want to catch this earlier now. We don't want to wait and try to patchwork and solve problems down the road. We want to get these students back in school, Gary. And that's why, Lori, Betsy, all the district superintendents and principals and people that are working on this, it's so important for us to focus on this issue together, is because we have an opportunity to start working on this problem now instead of waiting till it's too late.
Now, Lori, as far as, Paul mentioned, getting to the root causes. Now, there's, probably a cause for every student. Could you say that? I mean, there's no one cause or couple of causes that is creating all this, is there? And the other thing I wanted to ask you about too was, because you can get down to that root cause with your data tool, right? With Maplet.
Absolutely. So let me talk a little bit about Maplet and then talk about what I would say are probably some common trends that we notice that are probably contributing to chronic absenteeism, or that have been identified as barriers for students that are contributing to chronic absenteeism. So the first thing I want to talk about is Maplet. And so Maplet was initially launched in 2015, and it really is the brainchild of Read On Arizona, with data powered by the Maricopa Association of Governments. And it really serves as a population level integrated data system that combines data from a range of programs that serve children and adults. And it's an associated interactive mapping tool that serves as a clearinghouse for census data, school data, health data, and family engagement data and literacy data. And one of those data points that it includes is data relative to chronic absenteeism, and taking that chronic absenteeism all the way back to 2015. And I know that Betsy touched on this a bit with Read On Avondale, because Avondale and Southwest Valley serve as Read On Arizona communities. And part of looking at that data was building the capacity of leaders or change makers, as we call them, to really take charge of looking at how they can increase, equitable access to high quality early learning settings, but also think about strategies to accelerate early literacy within their district and within their community. And part of that was looking at chronic absenteeism data. As we've all said, if you're not present, you're missing instructional time. So you're missing that instructional time relative to reading, relative to mathematics instruction. And part of that, I think we have to understand, is that data really serves as a diagnostic tool. And serving as a diagnostic tool allows communities, allows change makers and leaders to think about and identify and I know Betsy brought this up earlier, what are potential, root causes or underlying causes contributing to chronic absenteeism, but also thinking about strategies that can be used to combat chronic absenteeism. And some of the things that have been noted, and I'm sure Betsy can probably elaborate on this a bit, because we've seen this with with our younger students, is sometimes chronic absenteeism is tied to health problems. When we have, children who that have asthma, they tend to be out. Are there oral or mental health issues? We know that poor oral health leads to infections, leads to being out for school. We also know that there are other areas, barriers. I know that Paul mentioned that we see this high spike with children who are identified as Native American. And sometimes when we get into our Indigenous lands, there might be a lack of a nearby school bus. That's a barrier to attending on a regular basis. There might be, for students in general, there's not a safe route to school, or there are food insecurities that make it difficult to attend school on a daily basis. Paul mentioned earlier, for some students, the meals they receive at school might be the only meals that they receive. So they might be not having meals over the weekend or once they are home for dinner. So these are some common trends that we've noticed, but part of looking at that data for your particular community or your particular school district is using that data to engage in those conversations and identify what are the underlying causes within your community. So then leaders can begin to identify those preventative strategies and those early interventions to begin to implement and deploy within their community and in their particular school.
Thank you, Lori. So, Betsy, walk us through the process. You got I don't know, let's just say a fourth grader. He's, I guess it starts with the teacher, right? And she sees, okay, he's on number 5 absence or whatever. They're all excused, but what's going on here? So where do you draw the line? Where do you start taking action?
So that's a great question, Paul, Gary, because when we started this process, it was this great big mega data source. It was like, okay, how do we even parse this through? Where the power is exactly what you said. It's with the teacher. It's with the person who has really the best and first relationship with children and with their families. And so when we recognized that we needed to give this information to the teacher in a comprehensible way and build a system around it, that's when we included chronic absenteeism into our CTs, our cooperative teaming, when our teachers come together around their students and talking very explicitly around the 30 kids in my class, the 24 kids in my class, the 22 kids in my class, and we're sitting and we're really working on how's so-and-so doing. Oh, I've noticed we have a couple more absences. We may share him or her through, I teach math, you teach science, this person teach reading. Who has the best relationship with them? How's it working in your class? So you're having these real deep, in-depth conversations about children explicitly, their academics, their social emotional wellness, as well as their actual attendance at school. All of those things are pieces that are conversations in those CTs. From there, the next piece is let's have that conversation with parents. Let's start engaging with, hey, what's going on? We've noticed Mondays and Fridays are tough days to get to school, or maybe it's Wednesdays. How can we help with that? It's really important not just to be here at school, but to be here right when we start, because those first 15 minutes of school are equally as important as the last 15 minutes of school. So please don't, make appointments during those times, because it's not just full days, it's actually even partial days that we are really drilling down to that explicit data around kids. In addition to that, I have to give great kudos to the governor's office and the State Board of Ed around support with the safety grants and being able to have counselors and social workers in our schools, because we've been able to have then a champion of this very explicitly, that is a real focus of that team of auxiliary educators who are able to say, you know what, let's identify those barriers and let's find solutions to those barriers. And whether it's food insecurity and making sure that they have breakfast Monday morning to be able to get to school, then let's send them with a backpack on Friday with food to be able to transition throughout the weekend. Whether it is, talked about health issues, physical health, how do we make connections to primary care physicians, either in our areas or getting them specifically connected with our nurse, and through our mental and behavioral health services, through all sorts of, and I will tell you, any organization who's willing to come alongside of us, we welcome them to be a part of this solution for our entire community. So we have our mental and behavioral health organizations come alongside of us. We have primary care physicians who come alongside of us. We have food banks and opportunities to be able to say, can you help support us with these backpacks, or no hungry kid tonight, that type of thing. Any organization that's going to come alongside of us and help us to be able to remove those barriers to getting in. Sometimes it can be as simple as a phone call in the morning and say, hey, you know what, looking forward to seeing you at school. And some of our teachers will do that, or our social workers will do that, or our assistant principals will do that. So all of those ways to be able to, as you said, there is no one solution, because there's no one true barrier, right? Each one of our children have individual barriers to making sure that they're here every day on time. And so all of those pieces are important for us to be able to to navigate. But first and foremost, it starts with the teacher and it starts with the data and having those real authentic conversations around what's happening with this child and how do we navigate it and how do we help support them to get that limitless future.
And here's a question from the audience, and any one of you can answer this, and it's why haven't the parents been held responsible for the high level of absenteeism? As I recall, schools used to have a person assigned to follow up with parents of students who miss significant days of school. Now, I don't know. Is there anything in statute or anything for kids that are chronically absent from school, or then do we get into a different level when I guess the state gets involved and parents are getting in trouble, that sort of stuff?
I can address this much in the sense that, yes,
Okay.
there is legislation, and typically the consequential side of things happen later on, 12, 13, 14-year-old. And as we've stated, this problem is actually an early learning issue. It's a building of habit and building of foundations. And I have found, our district has found, and I think holistically found, punitive measures around this really do not make a difference. And I've said to our team over multiple years of, there's not a carrot big enough to incentivize, and there's not a hammer big enough to incentivize change in behavior. What really it is getting down to the root causes, getting down to those barriers and removing those barriers as best as we possibly can. And that comes from building a relationship. The bottom line is we are on a team together. We want our educators to be in collaboration with our parents, because I truly believe this. Our parents want the very best for their children. Our educators want the very best for our children. And where can we meet and find that united floor and be able to move forward to help that child be successful?
All right. Well, let's look ahead now. So, Paul, one of the things that you're suggesting is that you change start off by changing the definition of chronic absenteeism. So, why would we do that, and how would that help?
I'm sorry, Gary, my lights popped out for a second and I had to move. So
Okay.
you repeat the question for me.
I thought I had offended you or something.
Nope, those automatic lights.
Okay. So, as I was saying, let's look ahead and look at solutions here. One of the things that is suggested is changing the definition of chronic absenteeism. Why would we do that, and how would that help?
Okay, Gary. Great question. First and foremost, a number of people I saw through the chat asked to see the report, and Chris Kurtenbach, who is a great works with us at Helios and at Collaborative Communications, has put the brief in the chat for everyone. So everyone that wants to dig into more data, there's an opportunity for you to dig into that report there. One of the reasons to change that definition is to focus really on all students that are missing 18 days or more across all schools. And that is to, number one, just to highlight that we want to catch all students that are missing a lot of school. We don't want to just focus on those students that might be missing a lot of school in one school. So that's important to understand, give schools, districts a focus on all students that are missing a lot of school across the state, because mobility is an issue, and it picked up over the pandemic. There was a time when it was frozen a little bit because of rent freezing and eviction freezing, but once those were released, we saw mobility pick up again. And so we need to be able to pay attention to all of those students that are missing a lot of school between schools, because like Betsy and Lori's talked about, this isn't a one school issue or a one student issue. This is really, a state issue, and working together with this data and having that type of definition is going to be important to making sure that we get students back in school.
Before we go on to more, solutions, or talk about more solutions, why were kids moving, I guess, being more mobile in their schools? Why were they switching schools so much during the pandemic and recently?
Well, I could jump in first. There was a number of reasons. And again, back to, not knowing every single one. Number one, there were some schools that were open and closed during the pandemic. They had in-person instruction. So there were some parents that were looking for opportunities to have their kids in a brick and mortar school in class every day. There were people that didn't want to send their kids to school, so they were looking for more online opportunities, more homeschooling. There were people that their careers or different things happened, lost their jobs during the pandemic, and so moved new places. We have a lot of that happening all the time. But really, the pandemic, we also call the pandemic the Great Resignation. People changed careers, moved different places, had a new work-life balance. And so there was all kinds of reasons that people made choices about moving different places, whether they were going to send their kids to school or not. And so that's why we see all this fluctuation with mobility as well.
Can I add to that also? I do know that throughout the pandemic, communities in high poverty were again disproportionately impacted by the results with COVID. And when you think about a community like ours, we had a lot of grandparents who were caretakers for children who were not in school, so the toddlers and the little ones. And so mom and dad could go to work, and the school-age children would go to school, and then a grandparent was able to be there to be able to support the childcare during the day. Sadly and tragically, we lost many of that generation due to COVID. And so when that happened, we have a lot of families who can't go back to work because they have young children at home who need a caregiver. And then when you are home, then I have a little bit of a tummy ache or I have a little bit of a headache. It's a lot easier to just say, okay, hunker back into bed for a couple more hours. We'll get you there later. Or you know what, you're not feeling well, just stay home. So I'm not going to say the ease of it, but just a parent is there already. So maybe the impetus for getting to school is not quite as strong as opposed to, hey, I've got to go to work in order to be able to pay our bills. So you're going to go to school. You've got a little tummy ache. We're going to power through it. So it's just a different approach now based off of what's happening in our homes. I'm going to add to that. Paul just talked about family change, people changing their work-life balance and being able to work from home. Again, you're there at home, you can still do your work. And if a child has a bit of a tummy ache or a little bit of a headache, you know what? The perspective might be, let's just hang out at home. Let's get this out of your system. We'll get you back to school tomorrow. So I think that's a piece of data that actually has not been explored.
Well, that's how things were when I was a kid, get into school if you're not bleeding or so, Lori, so what can the state do to help the districts? And, we've got the legislature convened just as of yesterday. I mean, what do each of you want to tell your lawmakers? Obviously you guys want this on their radar, right?
Yes, and I think both Paul and Betsy have brought up good points. The State Board of Education, the Arizona Department of Education have all been partners in this work through the resources that they've shared, whether it's the increase in the number of school counselors so that there's a point of contact. So I think we don't want to paint the picture that the state is not involved and that they're not engaged in this conversation and thinking about and recognizing that there is a crisis when it comes to chronic absenteeism. I think Paul hit the nail on the head with in terms of some of the policy recommendations and how do we update the definition for chronic absenteeism to include no matter where the child happens to be attending. I think part of our next steps is really identifying that chronic absenteeism is not the problem of one particular entity. Therefore, the solution is not with one particular entity, right? When we talk about chronic absenteeism, that's an issue for the state board, for the Department of Ed. Helios is, as a philanthropic partner and entity in this work. It's for schools, for families, for community partners. And so it's for all of these entities to come together to really take a look at and determine those underlying causes behind chronic absenteeism and really think about collectively, how do we have shared priorities and implement approaches that address barriers for students getting to class? And we really have to approach it as this collaborative and as this collective model, because as I said, it's not the the problem of any one particular entity or agency. It's a concern and issue for all of us, and we all have to come together collectively to address it. And I think that's the biggest point we want to play. It's not just that of the family. It's not just that of the school. It's not just that of the Department of Ed. This is a crisis. And I know that Attendance Work, who is a national leader on this, says we really should be thinking about chronic absenteeism as a public health crisis, or along the same lines as a public health crisis, and really coming together to address it and solve it as such.
And
And
Lori,
when
I
does
might just jump in and say
Go
that Becky had a question just about that, about, the connection and what happened and its connection to the mental health crisis. And I think that's a great point that you just made, Lori, is you can't disconnect what was going on and what is still going on from the pandemic and the mental health issues and crisis that it has created in schools as well. Is how do we make students feel and their families feel that school is the safest place for them to be, and that they should be there. I think, Gary, you remember when we did the COVID convening or the COVID morning scoop about 7 months ago, that was one of the things the superintendents were talking about then, is reinforcing that school is a safe place for those kids and that they should be back in school, and it is that environment. And so connecting back to what Lori said about mental health and it being so important, I don't think we can highlight enough.
Lori, when does the task force begin its work in earnest?
Absolutely. So we will actually be discussing a little more about the task force at the chronic absenteeism convening later this week, but it is set to start probably around the spring. There's been just some turnover and fluctuation changes, but we are actively working on identifying who the members of the state task force are going to be. And we really want to think about it as a state professional learning community, this task force, with Read On Arizona acting as the state literacy hub and working in tandem with the Arizona Department of Education and the state board to identify those districts such as Avondale with Betsy, who have those best practices that they are deploying, and thinking about who else should be a part of that state task force, because we're also looking at how do we help one, not only build awareness and capacity, but we want to build that awareness and capacity so that we get to a place of moving down this pathway of behavior change for administrators, for teachers, for families and students when it comes to that engagement. And the beginning steps of that are the convening of that state professional learning community. But as I mentioned beforehand, how do we help create that guidance at a statewide level for implementation relative to policy, but also how do you take that policy and help it when it's boots on the ground for implementation for administrators and for teachers and for families, and simultaneously build capacity around families about the importance of why their child should attend on a regular basis. And as we've all say, starting earlier, this is not a middle school or a high school issue, as Betsy and Paul have stated beforehand. This really begins in the early years, even in that preschool space. And so how are we engaging families and thinking about those effective strategies that are positive and not punitive, so that we are really honing in on that engagement piece as a means of promoting this.
All right, Paul. Hey, you got a convening tomorrow, right?
Yes, not tomorrow, Gary, Thursday. So
Thursday. I'm sorry.
If it's okay, Gary, I might ask you to put that last slide up that we had too, as we kind of moving to the final kind of closing.
Okay.
But this is just the last slide is some recommendations that we've all talked about together and things that we can do in the state to really think about chronic absenteeism. You can see it in the brief as well. But Gary, number one, I want to thank you and the Arizona Capital Times for hosting this conversation. It's really important, and I think it's going to, be something that we're going to be talking about in Arizona for a little while. And again, I can't say enough about Betsy and Lori, who were the true stars of this meeting today, and had great insight into the problem and how we can think about solving it. I wanted to highlight for everyone back that you can go back to the chat. We did put a link in there to the brief where there's a lot more data that we can find a lot more things and dig deeper in. Obviously an hour, we could have probably talked about this for 3 hours and dug deeper in. So I would recommend any of you that have more interest in looking at the data, please have an opportunity to link to that brief. We are hosting a convening at the Helios Education Campus this Thursday, January 12th. There'll be further issues and it's from 9 to 12. Gary, I think you're going to put the link in the chat so that people can register. And just wanted to thank you all again and really hope to see you on Thursday.
And here's the link. Wait, 1 second there. There's the link, and oh shoot, the link didn't take. But where can they register at? On your website or?
I will have Chris Kurtenbach help us with that. In case something we don't get the link right on here right now this second. Gary will get the attendance list on this and we'll send everyone out an email as well. There we go. Grace Maceda just got it out there for us. Thank you.
All right. Well, we've come up on an hour and just want to thank everybody for tuning in and joining us with this conversation. And I want to thank our panelists, Betsy Hargrove, Laura Monsieur, and Paul Perrott, and Helios Foundation for sponsoring this. And just want to remind our viewers that on January 26th, we're going to have another morning scoop on groundwater. And then on January 27th, I'll be talking to all 3 of the state university presidents. So please tune in and, it's going to be a riveting conversation. And once again, thank you very much and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.